All right, guys, here we go on our last TBL lecture. That'll be on YouTube. This one is on the brain, and we'll be doing the IRAT and TRAT and the activities on Monday when you come back from Thanksgiving. So here we go. All right, so this is the setup of the brain. There's really four main divisions of the brain. We've got the brainstem right here. The brainstem is further categorized into the medulla oblongata. A lot of times it's called the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. So we'll look at all those specifically today. And then we got the cerebellum, which is the most posterior part of the lower part of the brain, mainly involved in balance. We'll talk more about that later. Then we have the diencephalon. And diencephalon includes both the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We'll spend some time looking at those today. We'll look at the hypothalamus a lot more next semester because it's really known as the master of the endocrine system. We'll look at all the hormones and all that stuff next semester. And then we've got the cerebrum, and the cerebrum's broken up into many little sections and divisions as well. So we'll look at that, and of course that includes both the right and left hemisphere. So this is just a picture of the brain from an exterior view here, seeing mostly cerebrum here, and then also some cerebellum. So the next couple of slides will kind of show when we remove the right hemisphere of the brain there. Now we can see the brain stem. So this in here is all considered the brain stem, and this is where most of our reflexive actions, most of our kind of automatic functions we don't have to think about come out of the brain stem. All animals have a brainstem, and that's the most common part of the brain. So we can see the different portions there: midbrains, pons, and medulla oblongata. Okay, and then here's the cerebellum. The cerebellum is mainly a center for balance and movement control. We'll talk about that coming up. And then we have the two portions of the diencephalon: the thalamus, which is above it, and the hypothalamus, which is below it. So hypo meaning smaller or less than or underneath the thalamus. Okay, and then the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, and that's the whole upper portion there. Okay, so we'll start with the brainstem. The first portion is the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is very important for many essential reflexes that are essential for life. So we have the cardiac center in the medulla, and that controls heart rate. And we also have a respiratory center, which controls rate and depth of breathing, and the vasomotor center, which is responsible for maintaining our blood pressure via vasodilation and vasoconstriction of arteries. Also, reflexes for swallowing, vomiting, and coughing are also all regulated by the medulla. Okay, we also have 5 cranial nerves that originate from the medulla, and those are shown here. We'll talk more about the cranial nerves on class on Wednesday. So in the brainstem, continuing down the brainstem, the next portion is called the pons. Okay, and the pons is really just a bridge for the descending and ascending tracks. So neurons that are going up and neurons that are going down, this is kind of where they intersect, and this is the bridge for that. And these the pons control some essential reflexes, one being sleep. So the pons is very important for sleep. And it's also very important for interacting with medulla to help regulate your breathing, your respiration. Okay, we have 3 cranial nerves originating in the pons, shown here. Okay, and the next part of the brainstem is called the midbrain, and the midbrain has these 2 separate sections. One called the corpora quadrigemina, and that is made up of 2 different sections. The superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Okay, it's called corpora quadrigemina, so that means there's 4 portions here. So there's 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. Okay, and we'll talk about what those do here in a second. This is the midbrain. Okay, so the midbrain is the smallest portion of the brainstem, and the most important thing to know here is that the superior colliculi are responsible for visual reflexes. Okay, so this coordinates eye and head movement. And then the inferior colliculi are responsible for auditory reflexes. Okay, so when you hear a loud noise and you get startled and your heart rate increases and your sympathetic nervous system activity increases, this is all dealt with by the midbrain. Okay, and then this is also where we find the substantia nigra. We talked about this already, and this is the dark region. It's dark because it's highly pigmented, and this pigment protein is necessary for the creation of dopamine. And we talked about the fact that Parkinson's disease is a pathology related to the neurons in the substantia nigra not being able to make dopamine anymore. Okay, and so this is for you guys to fill in. If you want to just do a little recap here, fill in the functions of these three areas of the brainstem that we just talked about. Okay, so then moving out of the brainstem to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is in the posterior part of your brain. It's underneath the occipital lobe of the brain, and it's shown here. So this is the cerebellum cut in half. This is the cerebellum out by itself. So the cerebellum, what it does, it receives all the sensory input from the outside of your body. So all the input about balance and about body location and position that comes from your inner ear goes to the cerebellum. Sensory information from your eyes telling you the position of your body in relation to the outside world. And then position of muscles and joints. So all of your little mechanoreceptors, receptors that are telling you how long each muscle is, how much tension you have on a tendon, pressure sensing on your foot and anything that's in contact with anything. All of this comes in to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum has a job of processing all of this information, putting it all together and telling your higher brain centers the location of your body and the location of all of the parts of your body. This is one area that's strongly affected by alcohol, and this is why balance is thrown off so heavily with alcohol consumption. So very important for coordination of sensory and motor functions. So your postural reflexes and coordination of complex movements like walking, any kind of complex movement, throwing a ball, kicking, all of the cerebellum is incredibly important for all of these things. Because you're needing to take in sensory information about where your body is, but then you need to send motor information out to control where you want to move your body in relation to the sensory information that you just gained. And so this is the cerebellum has the task of coordinating all of this information. Also very important for eye movements to counteract your head movement. As you might know, when you move your head and you have your eyes focused on something, your eyes stay focused on that thing. And this is because your cerebellum is gathering the information about the movement of your head from your inner ear, and it's able to get your eye muscles to move in the right way in order to keep your eyes focused on that object, because it knows how fast your head is moving from your inner ear. It integrates that information and tells you where your eyes need to be to stay focused. Okay, so then moving into the diencephalon, we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus here. So the thalamus is here. Okay. And the thalamus is very basic main job is to integrate sensory information. So all sensory input, including everything except smell or olfaction. So we have taste, vision, all of our feeling and temperature receptors, pressure receptors, all of those things come through the thalamus. They get kind of integrated, and then the signal gets sent up to the higher brain centers in the cerebrum after passing through the thalamus. Okay, then here shows the hypothalamus. Okay, so the main jobs of the hypothalamus, the one that is most famous for is controlling the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so this controls things like digestion, heart rate, also regulates the pituitary gland, which we're going to talk a lot about next semester when we talk about the endocrine system. Is somewhat important for emotions, and also regulates motivation and drive. So that includes things like hunger, thirst, and libido, which is just the scientific term for sex drive. So all of these things are regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, and you guys can do this recap if you'd like. All right, so the cerebrum is shown here. So this is the largest portion of your brain, and we're going to get into the details of the different sections of the cerebrum and what their functions are. So before we do that, we're going to look at just some basic anatomy of the cerebrum. And so we have this thing called a gyrus, and what a gyrus means is just an elevated ridge. And you can see there's lots of these elevated ridges in the cerebrum that kind of give it its characteristic look. Then we have sulcuses too, or sulci. So a sulcus is the indentation or the furrow part, the part that goes down after we go down from the gyrus. It's into the sulcus. Okay, and then we have these big fissures as well. A fissure is a deep sulcus. Okay, so we have one right down the center, separating the right and left hemispheres. Okay, and so within the cerebrum we have gray matter and white matter, and the gray matter is made up of the cell bodies of the neurons. Okay, so these have a grayish appearance, and so this is because it's dendrites, and the dendrites are non-myelinated, so they don't have that white appearance. So the white matter is actually the axons of the neurons, and they're myelinated, and that's a lipid-like substance, as you know, and that's what gives it its white appearance. Okay, so in the cerebrum, we have these different sections, and one thing that's important to understand is that the right side of the cerebrum is responsible for the left side of the body, whereas the left side of the cerebrum is responsible for the right side of the body, so there's this crossing over that happens. Okay, so we'll look at the different lobes of the cerebrum. So one lobe is called the parietal lobe, and this is where we find, one thing we find here is the primary sensory cortex. Okay, and so all of the senses like touch, temperature, and pain all are kind of dealt with in the primary sensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And so this figure here nicely shows where the different sensory inputs come from and where they go to the parietal lobe. And so this is the medial side over here where the foot is, and this is the lateral side of the brain. So this would be closest to that central sulcus in the middle of the brain and of the cerebrum, and this would be the lateral side down by the ear. Okay, and so what you can see here is the information that is going to get sensory information from the leg and the foot is going to come to the very medial side of the parietal lobe, whereas sensory information for the throat, the pharynx, and the tongue is going to come to the very far lateral side. And so it goes medial to lateral, and then also lower body to upper body. And you can see that lower body here, upper body there, face, and then some inter-abdominal areas. And what this is showing here is just the size of the different areas, show how much sensory information and how sensitive each portion of the body is. So this is showing that the lips are much more sensitive than the upper arm, whereas the fingers are much more sensitive than the toes. And so the size of the thing here is showing how sensitive it is. This is called a sensory homunculus. Okay, and so moving on to the occipital lobe. This is in the most posterior portion of the cerebrum, and this is what's called the primary visual cortex. And so this directly receives input from the eyes, from the retinas, and is going to process visual information. We also have another area of the occipital lobe called the visual association area, and this is where vision is processed. And this is about 1/3 of the cerebrum that's dedicated to processing visual signals. So obviously that's a lot of sensory information coming from the eyes if a whole third of the cerebrum is dedicated to processing visual information. But next is the temporal lobe, and you can see it's down underneath where your temporal bones are. And the main role of the temporal lobe is to process all auditory information. So all information from your ears comes in through the temporal lobe and is processed here. And then next we have the frontal lobe, which is obviously the very anterior portion of the cerebrum, underneath where your frontal bone is. And within the frontal lobe we have the premotor cortex and the primary motor cortex. Okay, so remember this is kind of the separation between parietal and frontal lobe. So this is all frontal lobe, this is parietal lobe back here. And so you actually have the primary sensory cortex right here in the parietal lobe, and primary motor cortex is right here in the frontal lobe. So just like you have in the sensory homunculus, we have a motor homunculus that shows the same idea, that the medial side is where we have lower body motor control, moving out towards the lateral side, upper body, and then down to the face and things like that. And so it's the same idea. Size of the region shows the degree of fine motor control we have for it. And that's it. And just like in the sensory cortex, the right side controls the left side of the body and vice versa. Okay, and then the premotor cortex is just anterior of the primary motor cortex, and this controls complex and learned activities. This helps plan movements, and it sends signals to the primary motor cortex and tells kind of which motor neurons when to contract for planning complex motions. Okay, and then also in the frontal lobe we have what's called the prefrontal cortex, and so that's in front of the premotor cortex, and that's the most anterior part of the brain. And so this is really what integrates sensory inputs, general assessment, interpretation, judgment. This is where intellect comes from. This is where willpower comes from, decision making, personality, kind of all these things that are kind of higher brain functions come from the prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain is lacking in a lot of other animals. And this is kind of what separates us from a lot of other animals, is the fact we have this prefrontal cortex. This is where our higher order thinking comes from. And the hypothesis as far as ADH goes, and the pathogenesis of ADH, is that we don't have enough inhibition in certain parts of this prefrontal cortex by norepinephrine, and that's why that drug Adderall is a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Okay, and then down deeper into the cerebrum, we have these areas called the basal nuclei, and this is controlling unconscious regulation of muscle tone and movement, and this interacts with the motor cortex as well as the cerebellum to help control posture and muscle tone and movements that we don't really have to think about. Okay, and then we have these different tracks in the cerebrum, and these tracks are pretty much tracks that are linking one area to another area. Okay, and so this allows for communication from different parts of the brain, and so this also works in a way to help us interact with the spinal cord. Obviously, it's important to send our signals from the brain down to the spinal cord, and those are some of the tracks as well. And then we also have this commissural track, which is its main role is to connect the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Okay, so the corpus callosum is the largest commissural tract, and so this is shown here, and this is connecting the right and left hemisphere, and yeah, that's shown nicely there, but you can also see it from the other view over here. Okay, and so we have 4 cranial nerves originated in the cerebrum, and we'll study these more coming up soon. Okay, and then finally we have what's known as the limbic system. The limbic system is all these different portions of the brain that are connected to all work together. So it's kind of a tract, but they all work together in different ways. So we have this kind of diencephalic structures of the limbic system, which are hypothalamus, mammillary body, anterior thalamic nuclei, all connected together. We have other parts of the limbic system which are going to be shown over here. And so what we know about the limbic system, we know that this is kind of the connection. One example is a connection of your smell sensation to your memory centers of your brain, and that's why there's a strong connection there, and that's why we have so many associations with smell and memory. And so that's one example of this. This limbic system is interconnected portions of the brain that work together to achieve their functions. And so yeah, different roles of the limbic system include emotional responses, memory processing, and receiving many sensory inputs and connecting all of these sensory inputs to other parts of the brain. So a few that are important, just like I was just mentioning, the hippocampus is where what we think of as mainly where memory formation occurs and also memory recall. Okay, the amygdala is very important for the fear response, and this is where early brain development starts. And we see problems with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of times originate in the amygdala, and there's this kind of overactivity of the amygdala, and any small sensory information can tip off the amygdala to cause the fear response. And then this part that I was just mentioning about smell being linked to memories and emotions, this occurs in the cingulated gyrus. These are different portions of the limbic system.